Sometimes I wish that Thomas would have just kept his big mouth shut. In my Father's house there are many mansions, Jesus says so beautifully in the King James Version, that even some non-religious folk probably want it read at their funerals. But Thomas just can't leave well enough alone. He has to press. But we don't know where you are going. Lord, how do we know the way? And in response, Jesus says some stuff that you probably haven't heard outside of Sunday morning church because most people do not want it read at their funerals. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There are, of course, all kinds of ways of dealing with this text to soften down some of the exclusionary edges. Most of us know that John's Gospel, the latest and oddest of the four, was written at a time when those who believed in Jesus had been excluded from their own religious communities. These words from Jesus reassure them that far from being excluded from the family of God, they are as close to God's heart as you can get. They found the most secure assurance of their own inclusion that anyone can find in Jesus. That emphasis on inclusion also fits with the larger context of these I am statements that mirror the revelation of God to Moses in the Exodus story. Remember when Moses asked God to reveal himself, and God says the name that even today Jews do not pronounce, a name that translates roughly, I am who I am. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, as you heard, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the gate, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the true vine, and this one, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We easily interpret 5 of these in a positive, expansive way. So why is it that we treat the gate and the way as negative and narrow? As Michelle pointed out last week, I am the gate serves a protective, reassuring function. A big part of the reason that Christians get all exclusionary with this text has more to do with how a certain wing of the church has interpreted it than what the text actually says. But even with all of these qualifications, there really is no way of getting around the choice that Jesus sets up in this text. Jesus is the way to God. This is the way. Not all pathways lead to this same God. This is the way to the Holy Parent that Jesus has told his disciples all about and shown to them in his life. This is the way to the God who liberates slaves and proclaims good news to the poor. This is the way to the one who wants to relate to us as a parent relates to their children. Now, before you get up and leave, give me a little more time to point out why I think a progressive Christian faith needs to stop treating every choice that anyone makes in the name of their beliefs as equally valid. For example, I'd argue that you cannot get to the God of Jesus Christ with any kind of mindset or practice that supports white supremacy. You cannot get to the God of Jesus Christ by practicing that kind of a racialized faith, not with the God who breaks down walls between Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. I'd argue that you cannot profess a belief that it is okay to keep on destroying creation, among other things, by denying our impact on the planet. A faith without the command to love God's creation as deeply as God loves the world is not a valid way to the God of Jesus Christ. It's not the way. And I'd argue that a faith which attempts to combine the idolatry of the gun with the Jesus who refused to take up the sword and commanded us to forgive 70 times 70, or 7 times 70, is an impossible combination. It cannot be done. It is not the way. Just because a person is able to choose many different paths of living doesn't mean that every path a person may choose will lead them closer to God. Now, I think we've fallen into this way of privileging choice above all else because we've witnessed how terribly abusive Christians with power have been to people through the ages when those Christians have imposed their culture on other people using violence. Even today, we witness how Christian religious supremacist ideas scapegoat trans people and seek to create a kind of Christian theocratic society by banning abortion and books, which has a lot of us afraid of the Handmaid's Tale hell that could be recreated when some Christians get their hands on too much power. But despite the best of intentions, I still do not think that adopting the view that it doesn't really matter what you believe or what you do is making the world safer or better for anybody. In fact, what might actually make the world safer and better for everybody is if there were more Christians who actually tried to live the way that Jesus taught us to live. Refraining from practicing an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth in a world that is tearing itself apart. Loving our neighbors as ourselves, including our trans neighbors, or our neighbors who are homeless, or our neighbors who are struggling with mental illness, all of our neighbors. Practicing forgiveness of ourselves and others instead of always trying to be right or to make someone else out for being wrong. Sharing what we have, weeping with those who weep, living the way of Jesus as if we believe that it does lead us closer to God. And I wonder if more of us tried to live it as consistently as we could, as generously as we could, as courageously as we could, if we might actually convince ourselves as well as other people that far from hurting other people, Jesus' way actually leads us to love all people more deeply and authentically than lots of other ways of living. We and others might just discover that Jesus was onto something with this way of living. In a world marked by fear of violence, brutality, and greed, Jesus' way offered peace, meaning, and community to ordinary people who had been fed a lie that the way to happiness is by attaching yourself to someone with power over others, or to wealth, or to station higher than you. Jesus offered a communal kind of living that extended hope and grace and a way to power so different from the one that has angered and disappointed and harmed so many. And while our society tends to idolize choices, especially in the marketplace, I think many people today are recognizing that the powers that be already limit our choices in countless ways. We are limited statistically by the racism that plagues our society. We are limited by the zip codes we are born into. We are limited by the wealth that our families start out with. We are limited by all kinds of factors that are outside of our control, such that an affirmation of choice is not likely to result in a deeper sense of community for anyone who is hungry for it. What is far more likely to bring connection to those of us who are lonely, or hope for those of us who are despairing, or justice for those of us with our backs against the wall, and peace in the world is more community. It's more people practicing grace and love and justice making explicitly. I think the world is hungry for it. One reason I know this is because of the Mandalorian TV series. Part of the Star Wars franchise on Disney, the show follows Din Djarin, played by Pablo Pascal. Din Djarin is a member of a sort of religious sect defined by their allegiance to the Mandalorian creed, combined with a kind of action hero militarism. Now, the action hero militarism part is not at all surprising. Action films and superheroes are a dime a dozen these days. But I can't think of any other show where a religious zealot is lifted up as someone to aspire to, as is the case in this series. In one scene, Din Djarin, who has been excommunicated from his tribe for removing his helmet in public, a weird violation, I know, he has to undergo a kind of baptism in the dangerous waters of Mandalore in order to be restored to his order. I swear on my name and the names of the ancestors, he says, wading into the water, that I shall walk the way of the Mandalore, and the words of the creed shall be forever forged in my heart. Now, the show has all kinds of problems with it, like what really is the way that they are professing? Is it bounty hunting for money? Or is it adopting cute baby Yodas? Or something else? But I think the popularity of the show speaks to the hunger that so many feel in our world for a way of living that matters. A way of living that is marked by a belief in something beyond oneself, that requires an allegiance to something or someone more than just an affirmation of choice. A way of living that recognizes that choices have real consequences for your heart and soul, and the life that heart and soul produces in the world. Like the character Omar in David Simon's The Wire, Din Djarin lives by a code that matters to him. And we can see that when someone lives by a code that matters to oneself, it impacts, deeply impacts, the rest of us. Now, Hollywood can hardly imagine a code that doesn't have retributive justice at its center. That's what makes Jesus' way so challenging. Unlike the way some Christians use this text, you will never find Jesus attacking religious minorities or imposing his way on others. You will never find him yippee-ki-yaying his enemies or unloading ammunition on them. That is not the way. It won't get you closer to God. According to Jesus, the way that leads to real connection with the creator of the universe, who also loves you like a parent, is a new way of loving and fighting for justice in the world. A way of loving and transforming that Jesus promises will lead you into that realm even before others have given up their foolish, violent ways. A way of loving and transforming that doesn't depend on Rome suddenly becoming less violent or less oppressive before it can be seen or experienced. A way of loving and transforming that doesn't depend on anything outside of the one who chooses to walk the way. We know that that way of loving and transforming is demanding. It is not without pain, loss, sometimes even sacrifice. Yet even so, Jesus tells us this is the way to God. Imagine if Christians spent the same amount of energy that has been used to defend Jesus as the way, actually loving and healing and living that way that he had commanded. I wonder how the world might change if more of us tried to live this way. I wonder how we might change if more of us tried to live this way.